Order! Order!
I'm with somebody who's hoping to be called to order by a future Speaker of the House of Commons. It's Emily Brothers. Emily is standing, or hoping to stand, for Parliament in the West Derby constituency. She'll be attending a hustings meeting later this week. Emily, how are you doing?
Yeah, I'm doing fine. It's very hectic. Lots to be done since getting through to the final stage of selection in Liverpool West Derby. It's been very much a fast-paced campaign to be selected using a variety of communication methods.
Before we talk about your ambitions to be an MP and the challenges you face as a visually impaired person, I probably ought to start by asking you about the general election, which most people will probably know by now is taking place on December the 12th. How optimistic are you for your party, namely the Labour Party?
I'm absolutely optimistic, and we will have an opportunity to go forward with a strong set of manifesto pledges to tackle inequality and austerity, to invest in public services. The constituency I'm seeking selection for in Liverpool West Derby, there are significant pockets of deprivation, and it is very much an area that has been left behind. And I will be determined, if selected, to represent the interests of this constituency in order to bring about investment and to provide opportunity and close that inequality. And I think the Labour Party has every opportunity going forward, and I'll be working for that success.
Tell me a little bit about yourself, because you have an interesting backstory. I know originally you're from Liverpool. You might not be able to tell that from your accent.
No, sure.
I'm originally from Manchester, and people can't tell that from my accent. I think it's the joys of special school, isn't it? But
yeah.
Tell me about your backstory.
Yeah, so I'm from a working-class family on Merseyside. My early childhood, I lived on Kremlin Drive in Stonycroft, which is in this constituency of Liverpool West Derby. When I was about 3.5, the family moved over to the Wirral because my dad had got a job at Vauxhall Motors. But I constantly came backwards and forwards to West Derby, to All Day Hospital, Children's Hospital, because of gradual sight loss during my childhood. But I also went to St Vincent's School for the Blind, special school in Utrey, West Derby. And I went there for 10 years.
We briefly ran into each other a couple of weeks ago at St Vincent's School. It's very different now, probably, from your day. What would your recollections be of being a student, a pupil at St Vincent's back in, the 70s, I guess?
I went to St Vincent at a time when the school was led by Sisters of Charity. Most of the staff were not nuns, but it was a culture that was quite formal, quite restrictive in the sense of things like access to information in those days. We didn't have things like the internet. It was braille books, and they were limited text. So when I needed to deal with some of the issues around, for example, my gender identity that I dealt with in later life, because I was able to access the internet and a whole wealth of information, it wasn't the culture where I could talk about my deepest feelings. And I do remember talking and breaking down a number of times and being depressed as a teenager, but being unable to express myself. And as a result of the restrictive environment, I was a strong advocate for inclusive education and have been so. And at the end of my time at St Vincent's, I was determined to go to mainstream further education. And the system really opposed me on that, because blind and partially sighted people didn't do that in those days. There was talk about it. We were sort of on the brink of the Warnock Report, which was influential in terms of inclusive education. But I remember having an interview as a 16-year-old at St Vincent's with an RIB officer, a blind person, and someone from Liverpool Careers officer, who were basically, trying to work out which special establishment I went to. Was it Queen Alexandra College, Royal National College? Was it some kind of rehabilitation service somewhere else? And my dad, who was very much supportive of my view to go inclusive education, was furious, and frankly, the meeting broke up in disharmony. And we went and I got in touch with Cheshire County Council, met a careers officer there, had an interview at the Mainstream College in Chester, and was accepted and went through further education there.
Moving on from school then, what sparked your interest in politics?
I've always felt political. I think the telling moment was at the age of 10. My consultant at Alderhay Children's Hospital felt he needed special advice in relation to my sight loss. It got so bad and that he was fighting a losing battle, and therefore wanted to get support and a second opinion from Moorfields Eye Hospital in London. My dad was on strike, as was often the case in the early 70s, as a factory worker at Vauxhall's, and couldn't afford to take me to London for that consultation. It was a collection on a picket line at Vauxhall Motors that put together the money to take myself and parents to Moorfields for that consultation, to pay for the accommodation, the train fare, and cover some basic costs.
And the injustice of that struck you, did it?
Indeed, but also the solidarity of working people in very difficult times for them. They were willing and able to contribute, and also reinforce that actually the state should have provided that support in the way the NHS has done now for many years. There was nothing that Moorfields could advise, and so we came home early, and there was some unspent money, and we tried to give it back to the strikers, who said no, I'd have to adjust to blindness, pay for something, get something that I might find useful. So I bought a Perkins Braille machine, and that still sits on my desk today, 40 plus years later, which I use to make notes for speeches, attacks on my political opponents. It's a lasting legacy to those striking workers that it encouraged me to become political. And when I joined the Labour Party at the age of 17 in 1981, the chair of the branch was that shop steward who had done the collection on the picket line.
I've got a Perkins Braille machine, probably of similar vintage, and I've just worked out we're the same age, by the way. You were 17 in 81, so was I. So moving forward a little bit then, tell us about your political career as an adult. Yeah,
so I was mainly involved with equality, disability kind of organisations. I was involved as a student politician, back at university and all that kind of stuff, but mainly around organisations like National Federation of the Blind, Disability Alliance, British Council of Organisations of Disabled People, campaigning around disability benefits, disability rights, whilst I was sort of getting on with a career. So that was sort of campaigning for disability living allowance for blind people, which we didn't get until the early 90s. Around the Disability Discrimination Act that became the Equality Act. And I worked professionally as well at the same time. I wasn't really, although I was a member of the Labour Party, I wasn't particularly active. And it was in 2010 really when I had a call from the parliamentary candidate where I lived, said basically they needed women paper candidates for council elections. Would I be willing? I agreed to that, but when someone asked me to do something, I like to do it properly. So I started turning up at street stalls and various other activities, and got more involved, went to party conference, and then suddenly by 2014 I was selected as the Labour parliamentary candidate for Sutton and Cheam in South West London.
You're a visually impaired woman, yes. Visually impaired candidate. What are the practical difficulties you have to overcome that fully sighted people in the same boat wouldn't have to think about?
Yeah, so I'm blind, I have no vision, I'm also hard of hearing, I use bilateral hearing aids, so that combination also presents difficulties. So cost is one. Although I had a successful career, I've been living on benefits for the last 5 years, and that is the case for most blind and partially sighted people. So cost, there isn't support, financial support in the selection process. There's possibilities if you get selected as a candidate. So you need assistance, to be able to get around. You need to do it quickly. You may not be familiar with particular places. It's difficult as a blind person in terms of networking to know who is in the room, who you need to speak to. indeed who you might need to avoid. Also, reading vast amounts of information very quickly. You need to have an answer to policy questions from journalists who suddenly want an interview about a particular issue. So you need support in terms of logistics. You need assistance in terms of the basic things that a sighted person might know, like your appearance, your hair looking okay, you're colour coordinated, you're somewhere you may need to give your guide dog a quick run, they need feeding, and where you may not have readily available support because you're depending on volunteers. They've got jobs, they've got family commitments, they've got other stuff to do. And holding that all together and people's goodwill is a real challenge. And that's particularly difficult if you don't live in that constituency. It's hugely costly, and it means that if you don't have a large union or organisation behind you, which is my case, and you don't have that funding or operation, then it's very tough. It's not a level playing field, and as a result of that, you're an underdog. Not because you are falling behind in terms of numbers of votes, but you're simply an underdog because it is not a level playing field.
You're clearly a woman in demand, Emily, because people might be able to hear your mobile phone, your mobile phone going off. Going off.
Well, that's the life of a politician in the midst of an election.
You mentioned there about being an underdog, and it isn't just your visual impairment that causes you to be an underdog. You've mentioned your gender identity. Yes. Could you talk us through that and how, if you like, that's what impact that has on your life?
I was depressed for many years. I knew that I was a woman but couldn't express it. A lot of prejudice around. I didn't have access to the information that told me what was possible. Eventually I did come to that journey where I transitioned, and it was very challenging for me, for my family, and for people around me. It put at risk a whole load of relationships, and it was a challenging time. I've come through it well over a decade later, and on a day-to-day basis it really isn't an issue. I just get on with life as any other woman. I'm fortunate that I'm able to do that. Many people who go through gender transition are not so fortunate in that perhaps they may not be able to sort of meet those norms of what a particular gender, male or female, might look like or behave like. That's not the situation with me. People don't generally know that I have transitioned, and that's fantastic. So I don't come across on a day-to-day basis prejudice around my gender or even people knowing about it, and that is great. But after a year's time as parliamentary candidate in Sutton-in-Cheam, my profile was getting quite significant, both locally and nationally, after some major speeches. And a number of prominent trans people had been outed by newspapers, and I was conscious that as a politician I wasn't talking about my experience, and I could be accused of hiding my past and not being honest with the electorate. And so it was a very difficult issue for me to come to the view that actually it would be more empowering also to talk about my experience. So in December 2014, I came out. I went on TV, live interview on London TV, to explain my gender story. And it was nerve-wracking. I was very worried that it may jeopardise my election campaign. In fact, the support was overwhelming from party members, the wider public, the media, both at home and overseas, and the coverage was very extensive. There was only one negative aspect, and that was the Sun newspaper, who published a column written by Rod Liddell, who said, "Seeing she is blind, how did she know she was the wrong sex?" And at first I pushed it aside as a pathetic comment, and social media took off. There were petitions which were going up by thousands within minutes. There was a lot of journalists who wanted my reaction. And as a result of that, I sought to push back against the Sun. In fact, the next day, I wrote a column in the independent newspaper, in which I said, when Rod Liddell goes to bed at night and turns the lights out, how does he know he is a man? And there was no answer. So my retort is he's obviously frightened of the dog. But the support was overwhelming. I worked with Hacked Off, the campaign for independent press regulation, and Transmedia Watch, who work around pejorative language and intrusion in the lives of people who've gone through gender transition. And we sought an apology from the Sun, which they resisted. So I went to the Independent Press Standards Organisation. They, 6 months later, upheld the complaint that I supported as a representative complaint on the behalf, which was taken forward by Transmedia Watch. So it was a landmark decision in that respect.
I guess when you're in public life, you have to have fairly broad shoulders.
Yes, you do.
What advice would you have for other visually impaired people who are thinking, you know what, I'm politically active or politically interested, I wouldn't mind getting involved in politics? What would your advice be to them?
Well, I would encourage them. You have to be very much focused. You need to be able to respond quickly. Certainly a journalist wants to rock up. They want a response from you. You need to move. You need to be able to respond to that. You can't faff around. And that might mean that your timetable changes. And you may not be familiar with the environment where you need to get to or around. You need people with you to do that, to network. We need more disabled people in those kinds of roles, but they need support to do it, as well as, of course, being confident and independent in order to deliver. Because at the end of the day, people out there, the electorate want people to represent them, to speak up for them, and to be able to do the casework.
OK, final question. Your phone's going like the clappers, so I know people are after you. So this is the final question. It's January 2020. You're now a Member of Parliament, and your name comes out at the very top of the private members' bill ballot. You can introduce legislation or anything you choose. What would it be?
I think for me, it would probably be around family law, around changing support for families in difficulties. I have a particular interest, for example, in developing the role of special guardians who are family members supporting a child in the wider family. Issues around the environment and disabled people is important for me. The pedestrian environment, where we have challenges, for example, around shared spaces for blind people.
Well, thanks very much, Emily. Nice to meet you. I know you're busy. Yeah. The phone's been going like the clappers, as I said.
I've got some constituents and families to meet at the local hospital, Children's Hospital De Haye.
So it's a busy day ahead.
So I have to be off to that and do telephone canvassing and, some more media opportunities. And, yes, get out there, meet people and secure votes for so that I hopefully on Sunday will be the Labour prospective parliamentary candidate for Liverpool West Derby.